Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending. I'm very, very excited for PACB extending the opportunity for me to share some insights on strengthening cybersecurity governance across the Nordic region. Just to give you a brief intro to me, I'm a cybersecurity and information security professional who's been working in Denmark for approximately 20 years. And I've worked in various governance roles and sectors, including telecom, IT outsourcing, food engineering, rail, consulting, and finance. I know that some of you who are attending this webinar may not actually reside in the Nordics, but you're probably still interested in cybersecurity governance, and I'm hoping to share some insights with you that could be useful to your organization. And just to get started, I wanted to introduce the agenda. So the agenda is divided into three parts. Who are the Nordics? What makes it so unique? The current cybersecurity landscape in the Nordics, specifically some challenges facing the Nordic region, which are multiple threats from the usual suspects. And then finally, enhancing cybersecurity governance, where I'm going to explore some strategies for strengthening cybersecurity governance across the Nordic region. So in short, who really are the Nordics? So the Nordic region is comprised of Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Iceland. And within Finland, you have an autonomous region called Åland. And Denmark has two autonomous regions, Greenland, which has been in the news quite a bit recently, and the Faroe Islands. And altogether, they have a population of about 28 million people, give or take. Some of you may have heard about the Nordics regarding the Happiness Index, which is formally called the World Happiness Index. It was some of the key metrics being GDP per capita, social support, health, life expectancy, freedom to make life choices, perception of corruption, and dystopian benchmark, which is basically a term which talks about the worst case scenario. Just to let you know, if you haven't already been exposed to it, the Nordic countries are all in the top 10 in the Happiness Index. Specifically, Finland is ranked number 1, Denmark is ranked number 2, sorry to say, but now they've swapped spots. A few years ago, Denmark was number 1 and Finland was number 2. Iceland is number 3, with Sweden ranked number 4 and Norway ranked number 7, respectively. And just to give you an idea of how the Nordics are in terms of their characteristics, they're basically places where you have high levels of trust. So very open societies, freedom of information, freedom of the press, low levels of corruption, according to Transparency International. They stress gender equality, high trust for both individuals and organizations and the government, and they're early adopters in digital innovation. Also, across the Nordics, you have universal healthcare with low crime rates, high standards of living, they're generally quite wealthy, and strong participation in elections. If we're to look at the stats around elections and voter turnout, the Faroe Islands, which is an autonomous region of Denmark, is the highest, around 88%, with Sweden around 84%, Denmark 84%, Iceland at 80%, and Norway has the lowest bar at 77%. In most elections, people usually either leave work early or take off, and in some cases you have digital voting. Characterized also by support for a strong digital infrastructure. So high-speed broadband, the penetration level is around 96, 97% by some estimates. Mobile connectivity, 5G, is quite high. Nationwide use of digital infrastructure, such as digital IDs, telemedicine, and e-tax. And just to give you my experience in Denmark, I have not actually signed a piece of paper in years. So when I first came to Denmark many moons ago, it's been over 15 years, they already had digital ID, something called NemID, which was introduced in 2010 around-ish. And from there, I was able to file all my taxes. I was able to register medical appointments with my doctor, et cetera, throughout using my digital ID. And just to give an idea of how it works across the Nordics, you have Bank ID in Sweden and Norway that was implemented in around 2003, 2004. NemID, as I mentioned before, is 2010, and it's been replaced now by MidID due to security concerns. And TUPAS was introduced in Finland in 1999. In fact, when I first arrived in Denmark, Skandia Banken, which was around 2005 or so, all of their appointments and all their banking was actually done on the internet. They had no physical presence. And according to the Digital Economy and Society Index, which was published in 2022, which focused on human capital, connectivity, integration, digital technology, all of the Nordics are in the top 4. Nordic societies, of course, are also recognized for their strong startup culture and innovation. And just to give you some insight into that and high levels of trust, the Agency for Digital Government in Denmark has on their statistical webpage, 91% of all users in Denmark are confident in communicating with authorities via digital post. 97% over the age of 15 have an active digital ID. 89% of users feel secure using mid-ID, which has been the replacement for NemID, as I mentioned earlier. And there are 2.1 million digital powers of attorney that have been granted since 2014. To give you an idea of the startup culture within the Nordics, and some of you may recognize these names and actually not remember that these are Nordic-based. You have Oda, Cognite, Tibber. We have Spotify, which I'm sure many of you on this call are quite familiar with in music streaming. From what I recall, they were the originator of music streaming. Now we have Apple Music and Google and other entities such as Tidal. You have Klarna, which has expanded to the US recently, and essentially it's a buy now, pay later firm. We have Einride, which is focusing on electric transport. And in Finland, we have Volt, or Volt, is depending on how you prefer to pronounce it, which was recently acquired by DoorDash, and this is food delivery. And Volt is everywhere in Denmark. And lastly, we have ICE, which is, we'll talk a little bit about later, which specializes in synthetic aperture radar, which is very important when we talk about the conflict in Ukraine. In Iceland, we have a few companies, Controlent, which is for supply chain, pharma supply chain optimization. We have Snurpet Power, which is about energy efficiency, and they assist customers in reducing their electrical bills. And these are all startups in the Nordics. And in Denmark, we have a very familiar one, Trustpilot, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. If you want to review an organization, you have the opportunity to provide a review and give them a rating. Too Good to Go, which is about sustainable food and reducing food waste. And Lunar, which is a fintech with a digital banking platform, which has become very popular in Denmark and recently has started to accept citizens of the United States of America. I'll delve into part 2, the current cybersecurity landscape. To continue the expansion of digital services and retain digital trust, it's very important that Nordic societies have secure, resilient, private, equitable, and transparent solutions. And there are a variety of factors that have influenced this landscape, some of which I will give you some insights into. And this has an impact on the third part, which we're going to talk about, cybersecurity governance. And the first impactful factor within this landscape is actually current EU legislation. And of course, this list is not exhaustive. There is some national legislation in each country, but overall from the EU perspective, these are the most influential pieces of legislation. First, we have NIS2. NIS2 covers essential important entities in a variety of sectors like energy, health, transport, financial services, digital infrastructure, and public administration. And its goal is really to formalize and strengthen cybersecurity risk management and also enforcing some reporting obligations. And like many of the other pieces of legislation, which I'll discuss in a moment, it enforces strict penalties for non-compliance. We have the Cyber Resilience Act, commonly known as CRA, and that applies to products which are manufactured or sold in the EU. And its purpose is to ensure that cybersecurity is integrated throughout the product lifecycle and it's essentially the first EU regulation specifically imposing cybersecurity requirements for digital products. Next, we have DORA, Digital Operational Resilience Act. It's more commonly known as DORA, which applies to financial sector, banks, insurers, asset managers, etc., and also applies to critical third-party ICT providers, cloud providers, for instance. And its goal is to harmonize ICT risk management and ensure operational resilience in the finance sector. It also enforces some incident reporting, digital risk management, and threat level penetration testing. And as I mentioned before, it directly impacts cloud providers. We have the EU Cybersecurity Act, which focuses on cybersecurity certification frameworks and mandates for ENISA. ENISA is the EU Cybersecurity Agency, and it builds trust through voluntary certifications of ICT products and services. And that has been in effect since around 2019. And the idea is the goal there is to strengthen ENISA's role. And last but not least, the most recent one, the EU AI Act, which is going to become more and more important over the next few years. And it's the first comprehensive AI law to ensure safe and trustworthy AI utilization. And it focuses on protecting some fundamental rights such as autonomy, human oversight, privacy, data protection, freedom of expression, non-discrimination. And here the idea is to have a human-centric approach, and it emphasizes transparency, explainability, and accountability, and has clear responsibility for top management, aka senior management and boards. And last, we have GDPR, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. That's been in force for several years. I don't think I should really get too much into that. And if you want some additional information specifically about the various legislation, PECB actually offers training classes on all of these. There are some commonalities across the EU legislation, which I'd like to mention. First, governance focused. Senior management and board accountability are specifically enforced, and sometimes personal liability. Senior management must approve and provide oversight for risk management programs. They must ensure that policies, controls, and policies are in place. They have to continuously monitor risk management and audit them. They have to ensure proper resourcing, and there's the escalation of incidents. So for Cyber Resilience Act, it's approximately 24 hours. For DORA, it can be as low as 4 hours. NIS2 is 24 hours. GDPR is 72 hours, and the AI Act is between 24 and 72 hours. And of course, the penalties are quite significant. 15 million for CRA, 2% of global turnover for DORA, 2% of global turnover for NIS2, 4% of global turnover for GDPR, and up to 7% of global turnover for the AI Act. Regarding the other items on this list, oops, sorry, click too fast. All you notice on number 4, I did not say third-party management. Many of these legislations are specifically mentioning supply chain management, and it's no longer enough to go to third party. In some cases, you must go to third, fourth, fifth party. So it's important to remember that third-party risk management is very important, but going to the third party or auditing the third party is no longer sufficient. You'll have to manage the suppliers and the sub-suppliers in order to reduce your risks. In fact, all of them have a risk-based approach, usually using a concept called proportionality. So if your risk is quite high, there are more activities to do to mitigate risk, and if risk is quite low, you may be able to accept the risk. Nevertheless, you have to remember that when you're doing risk assessments, that senior management has to sign off and be aware of risk management within the organization. Incident management and reporting goes together with information sharing. The EU is attempting to share information not only for lessons learned, but in the event if there's a EU-wide cybersecurity event that they need to manage, information sharing is a great way to ensure that the proper resources are put in place to address it. The second factor to influence the cybersecurity landscape are various threat actors. And here we have the most common or most severe threats to organizations and enterprises. We have DDoS, distributed denial of service. We have supply chain attacks, which are numerous and occurring on a daily basis, geopolitical realities, and a category of actors, which I call other malicious actors, which I'll get into in a bit. Firstly, just to give you an idea of the extent of DDoS attacks within the Nordic region, I have some links here to some common or some of the most impactful DDoS attacks recently in the Nordics. The first was an attack on Swedish Bank ID service, and it took several hours to rectify. In fact, the people who were most hit the hardest were actually Swedish citizens who were abroad who sometimes lost access to their bank account and were not able to use their mobile apps. And you can imagine if you're on vacation in Greece, for instance, and you're Swedish and you can no longer use your mobile phone to access your bank account, you can imagine the inconvenience there. Nordea was also a victim of a distributed denial of service attack. It turned out later that the entire finance industry in the Nordics was attacked by a variety of actors, and that created some outages on the mobile platform and some back-end systems. And then lastly, several Danish municipalities' websites were taken down, and they were rendered inoperable for several hours. And the CSCS, which is the Center for Cybersecurity in Denmark, stated that they're continuing to work on addressing the aftermath of those attacks and strengthening defenses. The incident for them emphasized the importance of robust cybersecurity measures and the need for constant vigilance against potential threats. The next threat, ransomware. Ransomware, for those of you who don't know, is a type of malware which prevents you from accessing your devices or the data stored on it, and it always or usually encrypts your files. And after that, the criminal organization or the threat actor may demand a ransom from you in order to decrypt your data. In some cases, you may find that you cannot log into your device, or you might just find that none of your data is accessible. So ransomware, in multiple campaigns, the financial CERT has said that they expect criminal campaigns from ransomware to increase. And the second link, which discusses Cloud Nordic had a ransomware attack, and they lost most of their customer data. And this has pretty serious implications, not only for Cloud Nordic because they went out of business, obviously, but also for customers who use them for hosting. One thing that many people will have to look at is, and Dora addresses this specifically, what would be the impact if one of your primary providers went out of business, was a victim of a cyber attack, et cetera, et cetera? How would that impact you? In the case of Cloud Nordic, they essentially said, we can't pay the ransom. We have no intention of paying the ransom. We pretty much expect we're not going to be able to get any of the customers' data back. So the end, we're just going to go out of business. And you can imagine if you're a customer who's been doing business with Cloud Nordic, you sort of would expect more from them than just to say, well, we can't pay the ransom, so we're going to go out of business. And this points to another very, very important factor when we're looking at secure, resilient digital infrastructure solutions, which is resiliency is really key, and you need to really prepare for these kinds of events. So in your playbooks for business continuity and disaster recovery, you have to account for what will you do if you have a ransomware attack. Do you have immutable backup, or are you just going to close up shop? In fact, closing up shop is an option from a risk perspective. Not that I would personally recommend it, but in this case, Cloud Nordic decided that they had no possibility to pay the ransom, so it's better to go out of business. Nordic Choice Hotels was also a victim of a ransomware attack, and they had to resort to manual operations in order to continue to check customers in. So you can imagine if you go to a hotel and you have a reservation and they say, sorry, we don't have the reservation in your system. Please give us all the information that you gave us via our digital platform. Again, it's probably an annoyance for you, but you can imagine the kind of resources that takes to go from a digital online platform to doing everything by pen and paper. Supply chain attacks. It's something that I mentioned before, but I just wanted to highlight a few key points. There's a dog barking outside. Sorry about that. Center for Cyber Defense has said that supply chain attacks are attractive targets because it's particularly when you're going to attack service providers, for example, because they're a single point of entry for multiple customers. Let's take the example of an IT outsourcer. If you were to attack Geoffrey's organization, of course, you could compromise my organization and you could probably maybe put me out of business. But if I were an IT outsourcer and you were to gain entry, you could have tens or hundreds of customers who you can then leverage that one entry point into multiple organizations, and you could expand the impact of your attack not only for those particular customers, but for the IT outsourcer. Hacker groups have decided that it's very, very profitable for them to attack key infrastructure or critical infrastructure, whether that be telecom, transport, public administration. These are all areas where they believe that they can use their capabilities to increase the impact they have. So you can foresee a situation where a hacker group would say, hey, how about we render your traffic system inoperable and you can no longer manage traffic within your country? That could be devastating. Or in some cases, for instance, Nordics, we have public transport. I will accept Norway and Iceland a bit from this, but Finland, Denmark, Sweden have very wide and very diverse public infrastructure in terms of buses and metro and rail and intercity trains. If you were able to bring those to a stop due to a ransomware attack, it would basically paralyze society. And lastly, the Center for Cybersecurity estimates that this method is going to be used by foreign states and cyber criminals. And I just want to make one quick point regarding foreign states and cyber criminals. Sometimes those are two separate entities, and sometimes they support each other. So if a foreign state wanted to attack another state and ensure that they don't have attribution, so that they can plausible deniability, in other words, they could cooperate or collaborate with cyber criminals in order to attack another country or key infrastructure. Geopolitical realities, the biggest geopolitical reality, is the war in Ukraine. And the war in Ukraine has led to several outcomes. The first being Finland and Sweden applying for NATO membership, Finland becoming a member of NATO, followed by Sweden. And there's extensive support for Ukraine from the Nordics. So for instance, Denmark has contributed approximately 7.5 billion euro. Sweden has contributed about 7 billion euro. Norway about 4 billion euro. Finland has had multiple rounds of funding for support for the war in Ukraine. And Iceland has had, which has no military, Iceland has contributed something around 300 million or so. And some of you who are on this call have probably heard about the sabotage of cables in the Baltics, the so-called shadow fleet, as it's called. And many of those cables are now being patrolled by NATO in order to ensure that the digital communications, which we all rely on each day, remain available to everyone. And lastly, we have suspected disinformation campaigns. This is an area which many intelligence agencies are trying to wrap their head around it and control and manage. It's very, very difficult. The internet makes it very easy for someone to create a disinformation campaign and basically use a shotgun approach and spread it everywhere. And if you're not careful, many people get incorrect information. And you could see this being used in some cases to try and manipulate election results. Other malicious actors, I've used that as kind of a catch-all for nation-state actors, cyber criminals, hacktivists, insider threats in the dark web. And again, in some cases, one or more of these entities may collaborate. So for instance, a hacktivist may attack a website, and normally this is more of an annoyance than something more serious, but a hacktivist may cooperate with a nation state actor for geopolitical reasons. And in some cases, cyber criminals might use an insider to gain a foothold into an organization. And of course, if they gain a foothold in the organization, and the insider could have a variety of motivations. That could be, I'm frustrated with how things are going at work. I didn't get a promotion I thought I was intended to get. I'm motivated by money, and someone offered me money to help them compromise my organization. This is a concern, and they're very, very difficult to detect and very, very difficult to prevent. Regarding the dark web, the Center for Cybersecurity has said that they're very, very concerned about dark web attacks. And part of the reason for that is that when you have a society that is quite open, has a high level of trust, and is quite wealthy, dark web information is a premium for all these other entities. So for instance, a nation state actor can go on the dark web and can obtain information about citizens across the Nordics and use that to make very targeted attacks, social engineering, spear phishing, et cetera, and that would have a huge impact on the Nordics in general. So now we get to the conclusion and what you've all decided to attend for, which is some strategies to enhance cybersecurity governance across the Nordic region. And I'm sure all of you are looking for some concrete advice here on how to do that. And some of the insights may apply to other regions or other countries. And the first place I'd like to start and to pivot and to support and expand some initiatives that are already ongoing is from the Nordic Council. And the Nordic Council is the official body for Nordic intra-parliamentary cooperation. And the Nordic Council and its associated body, which is called the Nordic Council of Ministers, addresses cybersecurity in a variety of ways. And basically, it's part of their agenda on digital cooperation, societal security, and resilience. And just to give you some key points, there is the Digital North. That's a collaborative effort under the Nordic Council of Ministers, and it focuses on digitalization and cybersecurity. And the aim here is to strengthen the digital infrastructure, improve information sharing, quite similarly to some of the EU legislation, and ensure digital resilience. The only way you can continue to expand digital trust and expand digital solutions within the Nordics is to make sure they're secure, resilient, and available. And essentially, this initiative called Digital North is used to share policies, best practices, and to harmonize regulations on cybersecurity within the Nordics. There are also joint strategies and agreements. So Nordic countries collaborate on incident response, cyber preparedness, and information sharing. They work through the national certs of each country to cooperate on frameworks to address cybersecurity. They have some specific focus areas. First, the protection of critical infrastructure, cyber hygiene and awareness, cross-border crisis community coordination, similarly to the EU, and joint cybersecurity training and simulations. In fact, 1 or 2 years ago, if my memory serves me correctly, Sweden took part in the largest cyber preparedness exercise in the Nordics, involving a variety of parties to prepare for cyber crises. Of course, the Nordic Council is not the only forum that the Nordics use. They also use EU, NATO, and there's also a partnership with the Baltic countries. In effect, the Nordic Council has determined that cybersecurity is a crucial part of its mission to make sure that the digital solutions such as identity continue to be available. And if you need more information about that, you can go to norden.org, which is the Nordic Council Ministers site, and also gives you some information about the various cybersecurity initiatives. There are 4 segments or 4 audiences which I like to focus on to use the Nordic Council. These are my own suggestions in terms of how the Nordic Council can be used to benefit cybersecurity governance. The first is the board and senior management. The second is small and medium enterprises. Third is educational institutions. And then the lastly, but not least, of course, the general public. And I'll address each one of those in upcoming slides. So one of my friends just had a board training, and I asked him if they had any insight into any of the legislation I mentioned before. And he said, yeah, we had some stuff about NIS2, but we had a day class, but I didn't really find it very valuable. I thought, oh, that's a bit of concern. As we know from the legislation and from our experience, the board and senior management really play a critical role in supporting cybersecurity governance. And considering the accountability that is enforced in the various EU legislation, it's really important, it's actually critical that the board and senior management have an understanding of it. And here I envision 2 paths. And I should preface that by saying, in some cases, my impression from my experience is that the board and senior management views cybersecurity as sort of a black box. There's a lot of jargon going around about risk and this and that, and there's heat maps, but maybe the understanding is not at the level we would like. So path number 1, I call it enhancing cybersecurity governance at the board and senior management level. And what I would recommend is education for board members and future board members at a Nordic level to provide comprehensive education to them to deepen their understanding of cybersecurity governance. And the educational program could be either sponsored by the Nordic Council, or it can be sponsored by the individual governments, but I think the Nordic Council is actually the proper mechanism to use. And it should focus on these 4 areas. Mandate, what actually should be the mandate of the cybersecurity function, and does that mandate exist, and is that mandate empowered? 2, resourcing, does the cybersecurity function and cybersecurity governance have the proper resourcing in order to be effective with their mandate? Roles and responsibilities in cybersecurity, are they identified and well-defined and supported? And lastly, cybersecurity risk management. What is the best mechanisms? How can they support cybersecurity risk management and ask the right questions to ensure that risk management, and particularly cybersecurity risk management, is effective and is managing risk across the organization? That's my first suggestion. Considering that boards and senior management have mandatory accountability, for me, it's very important that they understand these 4 topics. Now, boards and senior management are quite busy people, so I don't envision this as a long, I don't expect a 4-day training class for boards and senior management. They just don't have the time. Instead, what I'm recommending is targeted training a few times a year, which can be improved every year as the legislation becomes more and more embedded in organizations across the EU. Okay, small and medium enterprises. You can kill several birds with one stone here. Small and medium enterprises are usually hamstrung by a lack of resourcing or funding. It's difficult for them to attract and retain good cybersecurity talent. And most, or I'd say all organizations, or very few organizations these days, do everything in-house. So somewhere in your supply chain or somewhere in your vendor management, you have a small or medium enterprise, which is probably struggling, particularly if you're in scope for NIS2 or DORA or AI Act or any number of them, which is probably struggling being able to adopt or enforce or implement security measures. So what I recommend is that the Nordic Council actually provides resourcing, and the resourcing should be directed towards ensuring that small and medium enterprises can attract and retain cybersecurity talent, so that they can reduce the risk to their customers of cybersecurity or cyber threats. For instance, one of the frameworks I really like is UK Cyber Essentials and UK Cyber Essentials 2. And I would suggest either adopting that or creating a Nordic certification scheme. And really, I would recommend, if they can, to just adopt UK certification scheme. That would help small and medium enterprises who are very, very focused on cost and resourcing to elevate their cybersecurity hygiene, make them more aware, and reduce risk to the supply chain overall. So for instance, if you have a Nordic cloud provider and that Nordic cloud provider has 5 or 6 subcontractors, you could end up in a situation where the subcontractor who's on the 6th level has a cascading effect, and then your hosting provider is impacted, which means that you inevitably will be impacted. And when the enforcement penalties come, not to talk about the enforcement too much, but when the enforcement penalties come, they're going to ask you how you manage your supply chain. And if you don't manage your supply chain, it will manage you, to parallel a very common expression. Next, educational institutions. I had a conversation with a few students who are getting master's degrees in cybersecurity or cybersecurity related fields. And I asked them a few questions about their education. And needless to say, it concerned me a bit. It's very important, since in our field, we have a lot of burnout from cybersecurity professionals, that we ensure that when they get into the job market, they not only have a realistic idea of what they're signing up for, but also they understand how to advocate for cybersecurity. And here I would focus on these 5 topics. And I asked about each one of them in some way, shape, or form to those students. In school, sometimes you're taught that you're going to have this mandate and you're empowered to do A, B, and C. And sometimes the reality is a bit different. So it's important that those new cyber professionals have an idea of how to advocate for the mandate for cybersecurity and how to act as ambassadors. I use this expression quite a bit with some of my other friends who are in the field. The success of cybersecurity governance depends on the collaboration of other people in the organization. In some cases, or in many cases, your collaboration is not required for them to be successful at their job. So in other words, you have to be an ambassador for cybersecurity and have to know how to manage stakeholders in order to be successful. So stakeholder management is another area which I think is lacking based on the conversations I've had with them. They know that stakeholder management is something that's important, but it could be very important for them to understand how to identify key stakeholders and how to address them. And there are a variety of ways to do that, which you can find on the internet and speak to people about. There's Porter's 5 accesses, and there's SWOT and various mechanisms that you can use. In addition, the numbers 3 and number 5 kind of tie together, budgets and resourcing. What if you're in the position where you're a cybersecurity governance professional and you need to ask for resources? What is the best way to do that? And we know that that's a business case, but the business case is not in a vacuum. The business case has to take into account the organization's maturity from a cybersecurity perspective. It has to take into account how many resources currently exist. Is the organization swimming in money, or is the organization in a situation where they're looking to keep costs down, et cetera? And when I asked about project and program management, the response I kind of got was, well, it was a little bit of this and a little bit of that, but nothing that was really very helpful. And if you're a cybersecurity governance professional, at some point you're going to have to manage a project, right? And eventually a program. And it's important that you gain some insight into how to use those skills to ensure that whatever you promise to deliver is going to be delivered on time and within budget. And the general public. The first question I get asked every time I tell somebody I'm a cybersecurity professional is they ask me if I'm a hacker. And I can understand why. It sounds exciting when you look at the movies, people are typing on a keyboard. I'm in. You know, oh, this is easy. Unfortunately, as we know, that's not really the reality. And the public should understand the role of cybersecurity governance and how it helps to ensure that they have access to secure, resilient solutions which are available. So I recommend public service announcements, TV shorts or animated shorts. And here I'm recommending targeted, short and sweet, nothing too long because people have a very short attention span. They have a lot going on in their lives. And it's important that they don't get too much information at once. And some of you have probably experienced this in your own careers. When you're talking to or advocating for cybersecurity, too much information or people who are quite busy the results are not good. Social media campaigns targeting particularly the elderly. Currently in Denmark, the last year or two, there have been a lot of not only disinformation campaigns, but identity theft or cyber criminals targeting the elderly. And that is because they're not as savvy as some of us are with digital technology. And some of them are very easily, also because the society has a lot of trust, they're very easily duped. So they in particular are a target audience that should be focused on. Social media campaigns targeting teens. In my home country of the United States, I've seen a few people say, TikTok can have my data, I don't really care. And it's really important that teens and the public at large understand that when you're sharing data, you have to be sure who's behind that platform that you're sharing data with. And that can, of course, be difficult sometimes to discern, but it's important that all of our digitally literate public has an idea of who they're talking to or how to determine who they're talking to see if it's legitimate. Because there are cyber criminals out there who, of course, if they can go on TikTok and embed malware and reach 5 million people, they've now been able to expand their attack, right? And lastly, project and program management, design, and implementation. And this is an area where I think is neglected. So educating the public about what projects and what programs are being driven, for instance, by the Nordic Council, to ensure that the solutions that are provided to the public, whether that be medicine, medical, or tax, or power of attorney, or any of the other activities I mentioned previously, are actually secure and resilient, and how they're attempting to expand those to ensure that the public can access those services at all times. So some key considerations and takeaways. It's important that cybersecurity governance leadership has the appropriate mandate and resourcing. The board and senior management, by extension, have to be educated on cybersecurity risk management. After all, they're accountable now. If you look at NIS2, DORA, EU AI Act, et cetera, et cetera. I would suggest you can consider the implementation of an ISMS based on ISO 27001 that gives you a framework which is well recognized and well supported, and that can help you manage risk. And ISO 22301 for business continuity management can also give you some insight onto how to operate when your services are degraded. In fact, you can integrate the requirements for NIS2, DORA, EU AI Act into your ISMS, and you can risk assess whether you have to do more or less or nothing at all, and the outcome could be some activities to make sure that you're compliant. In the end, you can also get certified if that's what you think is good for your organization, but otherwise you can align yourself with the ISO 27001 or be inspired by it. And of course, ISO 27001 is not the only game in town. There's also NIST and a variety of other frameworks that you can use. For small and medium enterprises, the recommendation, as I stated before, adopt UK Cyber Essentials if possible, or create another scheme for the Nordics. And lastly, ensure to manage your supply chains. Remember, it's not third-party risk management, it's supply chain risk management, and you must do it on a continuous basis in accordance with the legislation that you're in scope for. If there are any questions, you can please post them in the chat and they'll be relayed to me by PECB staff. We have a question. How can Nordic countries improve cross-border cyber collaboration? Here I would use the Nordic Council. That they already have initiatives and activities around cross-border collaboration. Information sharing is probably the first mechanism, and information sharing on best practices, cyber threats, etc. What I would recommend is there are each sector has its own CERT, so to speak, and taking that information and correlating it, and then deciding we have specific threats that impact the Nordics, which may also impact the EU, et cetera, et cetera. And here's where we want to focus because that will give us the most bang for the buck. In other words, if we have 25 different attacks and the most likely one or the most used is a cyber criminal with ransomware, we should initiate some activities around protecting the Nordics from ransomware. And they could fund some activities which would then be delegated to the individual countries, and they would collaborate to determine what is the best way to address that, from large organizations down to the SMEs that I mentioned before. That would be my advice. What drives strong cybersecurity governance in Nordic organizations? Good question. And the answer is, in my opinion, is not black and white. It depends. If you're in a highly regulated sector, then it could be the regulations for that sector which really drive cybersecurity governance. If you're in scope for NIS2, DORA, Cyber Resilience Act, et cetera, it could be the legislation on the EU level. In some cases, it's customer driven. So a customer approaches an organization and says, I would like to do business with you, but I want an organization that is certified, or I want to audit you to determine the maturity of your cybersecurity governance before I decide to do business with you. So those are a few avenues that drive the conversation about cybersecurity governance. It's local legislation, national legislation, EU legislation, customer-driven, or sector. Oh, how can you prevent a man-in-the-middle attack? That is more of a technical question, sort of out of scope for this, but there are mechanisms by which you can detect a man-in-the-middle attack. And encryption is one of the ways that you should be able to prevent a man-in-the-middle attack. So if I'm communicating with someone, and we'll go through the TCP/IP handshake very quickly, which looks sort of like this. Hi, are you there? I'd like to speak to you. Yes, I'm here. Is everything good? Yes, we're good. Communicate. So if someone is in the middle and you hash a file, you should be able to tell that the hash has been modified. For instance, we're talking about a file transfer here. And if the hash has been modified, you know that someone has intercepted that traffic and modified it, and you cannot verify if that information is coming from who they say they are. So for instance, if I'm communicating with someone named Bob, and we both have digital certificates on each end, and we exchange keys, I should be able to safely send that information to Bob, and he send information back to me, and there should not be any man-in-the-middle attack. So in short, if you're using public key encryption, you should not be able to execute a man-in-the-middle attack. Of course, we can get into interception of tokens in an environment, all this stuff like that, but I think that's a bit too detailed for this forum. Norway is not in the EU. Correct, Norway is an associate member. Nevertheless, Norway has adopted many of the cybersecurity governance initiatives from EU legislation. And in fact, they will work with the Nordic Council. And the reality is, if you want to do business in the EU, you are in scope for DORA. That is my understanding of the DORA regulation. So for instance, if you are a US bank and you have a subsidiary that exists in the EU, you will be subject to DORA legislation. Phishing click rates. How can they be improved in a culture that is inherently trust-based, such as the Nordics? There are a variety of ways to improve, or in this case, prevent phishing. And some of them are strictly cyber awareness. Cyber awareness campaigns are sometimes underestimating their effectiveness. So continuous cyber awareness campaigns are one way to do it. If we were to pivot back to my presentation, educating the public about phishing and how it works, spear phishing, et cetera, would go a long way to assisting your everyday citizen in recognizing phishing. And let's be honest, not every phishing attack is easy to discern. Some are quite difficult, and some of you who are cybersecurity professionals have probably seen a few where you're like, oh, that's pretty good actually. I can see why people would fall for that. And it's sort of a cat and mouse game, right? You have organizations going on people's LinkedIn profiles and impersonating other people. You have people impersonating CEOs. You have people scraping information from the internet and targeting people with information that is out in the public arena and using that to shape phishing attacks. So the phishing attacks are becoming more and more sophisticated, and that's even without AI. And you can expect that trend to continue. And it's going to be a cat and mouse game. It's going to be very, very difficult to control that. But a cyber awareness campaign on a continuous basis, small targeted sessions usually work best. The previous position was that once per month you have a phishing attack and or phishing simulation, I should say, and then you look at the click rate. And now people are starting to say that maybe it's better to have smaller targeted phishing campaigns, specifically because if you send someone a generic one, usually if it's not well crafted, your average employee or citizen who's well educated can probably recognize that. It's more recognizing the ones that are actually targeted with information that's publicly available. The role of patch management. What is the role of patch management in maintaining security? Patch management is critical for cyber hygiene. It's critical for risk mitigation, and it's critical, obviously, to supplier management. In all areas, it's critical for a few reasons, some of which I've mentioned already. If a vendor sells you a product which has a vulnerability and you do not patch it in due time, you can end up being compromised by your supplier, right? And this has happened a few times. We've read all over the internet of, I won't mention names, various hardware providers having vulnerabilities in their software. And once it's out in the wild, then it's basically a free-for-all. Now, I have to say that not all patches are made equal. So whenever you have a patch available and you have a vulnerability in network, you still have to assess it. You have to determine if that patch is critical to your environment. Not every patch is critical to everyone. And we're not talking about 0 days, for instance. But even for 0 days, you may decline to implement the patch right away. And that could be because if you implement a patch and it breaks your applications that are publicly available, you may have to try and find a mitigation. And in other instances, the 0 day, if it's a 0 day and you get a patch, you just implement it right away and you hope for the best. Okay, everybody, that was our last question for the day. Again, I'd like to thank you all for attending and taking time out of your busy schedules. And on behalf of PECB, please have a good evening. Thank you.